Hi, so today we'll be talking about pedigree method. Out of other different methods we have covered so far, like we have talked about prenatal diagnosis, we have talked about genetic counseling, community screening, and three or four methods overall we have talked about so far in studying the genetic diseases and how to identify these genetic diseases, right? So one of the important and one of the basic and very easy to use method is pedigree method. We are to some extent aware of what pedigree is because in different modes of inheritance, in studying heredity, pattern of inheritance, we have come across different pedigree charts. And to understand those charts, it is important to understand the method, the pedigree method so far, what it is and what is the applications, how to use it, what are the problems associated with it, where possibly we can use it, and things like that. So we'll be talking about this in detail today. So pedigree, basically, how do we understand pedigree is it's an orderly diagrammatic representation of the familial representations amongst the relatives with respect to the person whom we are trying to understand the genetic diseases associated, right? So for one person we'll start and then we'll go diagrammatically representing relationships of that person with his or her family and their further relatives, distant relatives as well. So it represents the charts of family histories which shows the phenotype and the relationships of those individuals, right? So we generally represent the phenotypic characteristics if at all it is visible in one particular individual associated with that proband or with the person whom we are targeting, the target individual. And the lines and the squares and the split lines, the mating lines, all of these are basically implicating one or the other form of relationships amongst these individuals within one given family or the whole ancestral relationships, right? This method, basically, in social sciences, in social anthropology, if we do the practicals associated in studying the social histories of any village or for any a very broader community. So how do we understand their relationships is using the method called as genealogy. When we are saying here, we are trying to depict diagrammatic representation from a person to his or her relatives. Similarly, in genealogy, we draw from the person whom we are interviewing, from him or her, we try to understand the associations his or her sisters, brothers, who he has in his family, how they're related, what is the term used. For instance, if we compare a West Indian reference to your sister is completely different to how you call your sister in the term that you use to refer to a sister in northeastern states. So this reference and studying how the social understanding or the social idea of labeling a person or labeling a relationship, or more than that, right? It's not just the label but also the relationships or the kinship understanding, so to say, in social sciences. That is how we delineate this idea of genealogies. So therefore there's a parallel between genealogical method and the pedigree method. Pedigree, so to say, is used in the biological field and genealogy is used in the social sciences. So that becomes one basic method, but more or less they are in a sort of depiction way, they are quite similar. Now this chart basically displays a sort of family tree which helps to analyze the pattern of inheritance of a particular trait across different generations of that family, right? So using that family tree, again here we are implying that it is about the pattern of inheritance or the mode of inheritance that we are trying to understand using the pedigrees. itself, it does not speaks that you know that this, okay, like for instance prenatal diagnosis, if we had to say, you do the diagnosis and you get the result, you draw a pedigree, you analyze the pedigree, and then only you can see, okay, you must have that knowledge that how do you understand that pedigree, how do you see whether it's a dominant trait being passed on to every generation, or is it skipping one generation and be passed on. So how do you understand the dominant and the recessive mode of inheritance, how do you see the sex linked and the autosomal mode of inheritance. All of these therefore becomes important to have, you know, the baseline knowledge to analyze these pedigrees. Okay, so that is how we understand and analyze the patterns of inheritance associated with a particular trait being passed on from generation to generation within one family. Now, pedigree charts are basically the diagrams that show the phenotypes, and in some cases, we label the genotypes as well if a person is having a genetic predisposition. And you know, in our further analysis, we have identified that, okay, one mutated gene is associated with this particular individual, so we give a label to that, right? For any generation across different generations, across all the ancestors that we have using that pedigree. While commonly used in the human families to track the genetic diseases, the pedigrees can also be used for any species or any inherited trait. Okay, so far it's clear, I guess, using the mode of inheritance, using the whole idea of analysis of pedigree, we can identify what exactly is the genetic disease, how it is being passed on, and how is the mode of inheritance across different generations. Now, geneticists use a standardized set of symbols to represent an individual's sex or their family's relationships and the phenotypic characteristics. Right? For instance, if you will see in the pedigree, we'll be talking about it. The squares are generally the representation of male, circles are the representation of females, but if at all it's a different representation in some school of thoughts, then they will be labeling it in the reference section. But generally what we use is the square and the circles for males and females respectively. Now, these diagrams are used to determine the modes of inheritance of a particular disease or a trait and to predict the probability of its appearance among offsprings. Okay, so again we are coming back to the idea of mode of inheritance that we are starting using the pedigrees. Based on how the appearance or how the phenotypic characteristic of a person is represented in the pedigree, you will try to delineate if it has a particular genetic predisposition or genetic association of a disease to it or not, right? So that is one thing. Pedigree analysis is therefore important when we study in terms of both research or as we all talked in terms of genetic counseling. We draw the family histories, we draw the pedigree, we try to understand if there is any inheritance pattern observed in the whole family or different generations. So that becomes one important tool in both research and as well as its applications. Okay. Now, this is one reference that I came across, that this paper, it was labeled, it was published by Frebes in 1905 on the inheritance of digital malformations in man. So this is the paper where we generally find the first reference to use of pedigree, and he tried to show the pattern of autosomal dominant inheritance of a human anomaly, which was the condition of brachydactyly. That is, there are shorter digits in your hands and your limbs. So here, if we see in the pedigree, the black circles are generally the affected males, black and the darkened ones, the black circles are the affected females, and the squares are representing, the black squares are representing the males. Okay, this is another, like this was one initial reference given to it. How we draw is in a linear pattern. Here it's a circular pattern. Both the ways it's like one generation wise, the generation wise it's labeled, plus within one generation all the siblings are labeled. All the siblings or all the members of one given generation are labeled in an orderly manner. So this becomes one classic representation of pedigree charts. Plus the numbers represented in one given generation indicates the position of that person in that generation in that pedigree chart. Okay, so for instance, if you will see here, there are 8 generations that we are talking about. Okay, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth. There are 8 generations to whom we have traced back the pedigree. Every generation there are, like in the second generation, you will see there are 11 people, and based on the seniority or the order of birth, all of these are labeled from in an increasing fashion, right? So this is one thing. Then there's also the reference of use of pedigrees in the official records of College of Arms based in England or also Wales. It dates back to 16th and 17th centuries. Basic idea here was because they were the soldiers, and there was this idea of having access to particular accessories within the army if you are associated with, if your ancestor has been a participant of that army. Okay, they were here, they served for the army. So if at all you were serving for the army at once, only then your further generations or your subsequent generations could have access to the accessories from army. And there was some discount or something like some associated rates with that position. So this pedigree was therefore used to regulate the use of coats, specifically coats becoming one of the accessories for our army people serving in the extreme climates. So this register was maintained to identify whose ancestors or whose grandfather was working here or whose father was working here, and only then you will have the access to those codes, and how many times you can claim it and things like that. So all of these records were used to see, it was not associated anything with the genetics, but to maintain the ancestral relationship or the ancestral role in having the access to resources by one particular generation, subsequent generation, helped them out to see if a person is not, there's not a false claim or there's not a fraudulent case claiming that their ancestors were there, or and they could access those codes. So this was one reference that I came across, and these records were generally not accessible for the general public, right? So therefore this was one record that we can find with respect to the pedigrees in England, in dating back to long back 16th and 17th centuries. Now pedigree charts basically they're talking about the patterns of inheritance of any single trait that is existing within a family. Each pedigree represents all of the available information about inheritance existing within a family. The pedigree chart is therefore drawn using the factual informations that we could collect, but there is always some possibility of recall bias or memory bias, and therefore some of the informations could be skipped, right? And you cannot completely rely on the information given by the family members, because they could not really recollect on every single diagnosis, or back then you just talked about the symptoms, not even symptoms, you just talked about, okay, this is happening, you go for this cure. There was no particular diagnostics, there was no particular treatment, and so there was no particular record maintenance in that context. So therefore that could be one drawback associated with the pedigree that there are possibility of a lot many errors with respect to the recall bias, right? So everything that we consider in the pedigree charts are generally based on the factual information. As we have talked in previous video also on pedigree, that you refer to the medical records, you refer to the date of birth of that particular hospitals, or those records are used generally if at all a family is not able to recall any evidence from their family, right? So okay, this was one thing. Then in real pedigrees, if we talk, there are further complications that could possibly arise, because in the genotypic studies we know about the incomplete penetrance, right? Or the late age of onset of any disorder, or different expressions of a particular allele associated with diseases, as in variable expressivity, or we can also say over the generations there has been a form of mutation of that particular gene, and therefore the expression is different for across different generations. So these complications needs to be identified. You need to do a genetic screening about it. You need to have a regular follow-up if at all you have a risk of late onset disorder. So these complications needs to be dealt very carefully. If a subjective understanding has to be built about a disease and their prevalence within one family, these complications, if ignored, could really impact badly on that family. Because if at all they are planning and they have a late onset, which has a full chance of being passed on to the next generations. So this sort of counseling, this sort of analysis, understanding all the expressivity of a gene needs to be carefully administered. Now a pedigree may be drawn when we are trying to determine the nature of a sort of newly discovered disease in a family, or when an individual with a family history of a disease wants to know the probability of it being passed on to the subsequent generations. So anyway round, if you are trying to understand the idea of a disease being prevalent in a family, in a generation, in the gene pool of that family, then again we need to study it. If we are concerned that it should not be passed on to the next generations, then we need to study it. Or if we know that there is some new discovery, or doctors claim that there is a new discovery of new mutation of a particular gene in your family, then again you need to do a sort of family history and draw the pedigree charts of that family, so that not just for now but even for subsequent generations, if people are coming, these pedigrees could be used then again. So right, so therefore a careful monitoring needs to be done. Depending on the need of the family, these pedigree charts are drawn. So this is a sort of indication of how you use the symbols in drawing the pedigree charts. Some of the references would vary, but what important it is, when you draw a pedigree chart, if at all it is deviating from the standardized or generally used symbols, then you need to give a reference to what exactly you are referring to by that symbol. So for instance, in some situations, in some pedigrees, you will see you have a diamond shape. For male you have a square, you have a circle for female. For some representation you see diamond. So diamond sometimes is is an unknown sex of the child, but if at all it is represented by a different symbol in your pedigree, then you need to give a reference or an index of how you are indicating that symbol. Okay, so for further clarity, now how we start drawing the symbols. First person that we refer to, or the affected individual who brings the family to the attention of any geneticist or any medical professional, he or she is called as a proband, and this is how you represent them. The index, or in genealogies we call them ego. So index case or proband, you darken them or you just label them and you write them, you write their ego or you write their proband. So that is how you refer to the first person who is affected and who has reported about their condition, or who is interested in knowing the condition of their family, and they have contacted the geneticist. He or she is called as proband. If we see that that individual himself or herself is affected, in that case we are darkening the label. For instance, here it's darkened, therefore we say that it's an affected proband. But if he or she is interested in knowing about their parents, or they are not directly asking about themselves, but they are asking that whether they would be having it or not, right? So because they are not showing the symptoms, it could be a late onset. They want to know whether, because their family has it, whether they are exposed to it or not, right? So therefore, if they are having some symptoms, if they are diagnosed with the disease, if they are affected with the disease, then they will be having a dark symbol of their particular gender, right? Sometimes we have a half-filled symbol. Now here, like, this is one representation of carrier person. Here in the square you have a half-filled box, half-filled symbol. But in some cases you will also see a person, a symbol like this. Let me draw it like this. Oh, generally it's female. Oh, it's a circle, and then you draw a dot in between, and then you say he or she is a carrier. Okay, so sometimes this symbol is half filled, sometimes it's a dotted symbol. Then you indicate that, any way around you use it, you just need to label or mention in the index. If it's something deviating, then you just need to label it in the index. Sometimes when it is half filled, or sometimes when it is dotted, that is the situation when you're trying to indicate the carrier of that particular disease. This is someone who does not have any symptoms of the disease, but who pass the disease to the subsequent generations because they are heterozygotes. Okay. Here it is important to be noted that when a pedigree is constructed, it is often unknown whether a particular individual is a carrier or not. So not all the carriers are always explicitly indicated in a given pedigree. Okay. Again, if at all something new or something drastically is indicated in your pedigree, you keep a question mark around it. Something which is not clear, or something which is not explicitly coming out of your analysis, and which you need to later get a detail about. So while constructing these pedigrees, you keep all of these things in mind. Your labeling actually is the analysis. Your labeling actually is implying on your results and your further counselings or further observations. So therefore, every single mark that you make in the pedigree chart is having some or the other indication, and therefore it needs to be very, very, very carefully done. Okay. These are further symbols, like different. Here it's specifically talking about males, then you're talking about females, and some of the weirdly mentioned labels which are generally not indicative, or generally not used in a common pedigrees, but have their existence. For instance, if we talk about the recent trend, you need to have the label for the third gender, or you need to have the label for the other forms of gender, right? Then there are associated events like surrogacy or extramarital mating or separations, right? So all of these things therefore need to be very carefully indicative of Now see here, in this diagram, the bigger diamond is indicative of an unknown gender of that person. In the next to it is a small diamond who lived for a day, a neonatal death. So therefore these two needs to be very carefully drawn, because if at all you just draw a bigger diagram, bigger one, and you are trying to indicate this, a bigger diagram bigger symbol would indicate this, so there could be a lot of confusion. So therefore specifically every label, every symbol needs to be very carefully put up, right? So here about the fraternal twins, identical twins who are male, then identical twins who are female, an adopted child, adopted male, adopted female. So all of these contemporary issues. In fact, we need to talk about more contemporary scenarios right now, because these labels needs to be revised and needs to be updated in the current scenarios. Okay. Now these properties of the pedigree charts. Basically, as we know, these pedigree charts present the family's information in form of the readable or the presentable charts, right? You can analyze them very easily. These are very simple diagrams, and generally we also call them as the family trees. The main idea of these pedigree charts is to understand the family's history, and sometimes any specific detail that you cannot realize or you cannot obtain using the other methods of identifying genetic diseases. You construct the family's histories, and therefore sometimes family recall could not be there, or there could not be records to check the evidences, or the factual informations won't be available to you. So in that situations, these informations could also be uncertain, but more or less you are trying to draw or represent a detailed family history of that particular person associated with different families, different relatives, or different persons in one given family. Now these relationships are shown as a series of lines, as in when here also we have talked in pedigree. I mean, this is a classic representation. We generally use it in a linear form, in a horizontal line sort of. Now you see how lines are depicting different things. When you are trying to represent male and female and the mating pattern between them, see here, you're trying to identify the mating pattern between them. You show with the the horizontal lines between the two people, right? But when you're trying to show the siblings, or the offsprings of those mating relationship, you try to depict using the vertical lines here. Like in case of siblings, you show the relationship between siblings using this diagram, these form of lines. But when you're trying to show the relationship with the parents, you draw a vertical line. Okay, mating pattern is horizontal, consanguineous is double dash. So also when we are talking about generations, we label the generations. Every generation is labeled one in form of Roman numerals. In fact, when we are talking within one generation, we are labeling every single individual using the Arabic numerals. Roman numerals as in I, as in I represents one, double I as in this one. I'm pretty sure you are aware of what Roman numerals are. This is 1, this is 2, right? This is 4. These are Roman numerals. Arabic numerals is 1, 2, 3, sort of, right? So every generation we represent by Roman numerals, and every individual is represented by the Arabic numerals. Now here the analysis is done using the principles of Mendelian inheritance. Mendelian inheritance as in the recessive trait, the dominant trait, we have already discussed in the previous videos in our previous semester. So just go through that video again if at all you have any confusion. But these patterns therefore needs to be clearly understood, so that we can delineate a clear and proper analysis about that pedigree. Okay, so just go through these Mendelian inheritance if you want to brush up your information. Often, these pedigrees are constructed to identify the afflicted member with a genetic disorder, and the person who has contacted is called as the proband. So, this was about it. The pros and cons. Generally, pedigree determines phenotypes, the pattern of inheritance, mode of inheritance. To some extent, we are also able to understand, to a large extent, we are able to understand the genetic risk if we are also determining the genotypic predisposition of that afflicted person with a disease. So therefore, to a lot more extent, we are talking here about the genetic diseases, and that profile is available or is easily we can obtain that information, and we can draw the genetic risk, we can draw the genetic profile of that particular family. So that becomes a pros. But the con here is associated with the difficulty and the challenges and the complications we have discussed in terms of collecting that particular information, right? Now, advantage here is, again, when we have the analysis, we are able to at least come to a conclusion. We can have a sort of counseling if a person is having the genetic disease or a certain mode of inheritance is being identified in that pedigree. So genetic counseling could be used, and we can further inform the family about the awareness, or we can help them making a mature decision. We've all talked about genetic counseling in detail, so that could be done. In as a challenge, there are recall biases, right? One is in terms of the lack of availability of factual information, but also with respect to the families tracing back to the histories, or families tracing back to one particular event in like 3-4 centuries back, 3-4 generations back, sorry. So therefore, that could be a recall or a memory bias. The pros, on the other hand, is its application in gene therapy. Subsequent intervention could be provided if at all a person is identified with particular genetic disease, or a particular genetic disease is being running in the family. Then in that case, to avoid any subsequent generation being afflicted by that genetic disease, or to cure that mutated gene, anyway around, you can provide them the solution of gene therapy if at all family is able to and depending on the financial condition and every other parameters, gene therapy could be one good solution. Con could be it does not really possess enough information to identify the modes of inheritance, right? For instance, if in one generation the affected person is there, but you cannot really recall. In fact, we've all talked that back then there was no specific diagnosis, there was no specific cure, so you do not have specific information about all of those symptoms and all of those diagnostics. So if at all that person was having the genetic disease, you cannot really trace back to that information, and that lack of information could be impacting on understanding the mode of inheritance that you could really delineate. If at all he or she was the only person whose information is not accessible, but he or she was the only person who was affected by that disease in that particular generation, then if their detail is not available, you will simply consider that no, it's like not visible there, so you'll just skip it. But that could be one information that could really imply that it's a dominant trait, it has to be passed on to next generation, and because your information was not available, you will say that okay, this generation skipped, and therefore it could be a recessive disorder. So therefore, that information bias could really result on your analysis. Also, in some situations, these genetic disorders do not really have a single form of inheritance, and to understand these complexities, you need to have a detailed and factual information about that particular person or that particular individual who all are suffering from a genetic disease in your family. So therefore, these information gap, and every lack of factual information could really have a major implication on analysis, on observations, on conclusions, and therefore further methods that you could sort to after having the detailed talk with your geneticist. that could be really impacted. So therefore all these things needs to be carefully monitored when you're trying to do a pedigree analysis. Again, when we talk that this is more of a visual observation that we are making, or verbal communication, so there could be again challenges associated with it. So all of these things needs to be taken care of when we are talking about pedigree methods. Okay, so this was about pedigree. Next session we'll be talking about there are 2-3 methods left, so we'll be talking about them. Any questions you can just mention in the comment box. You can communicate to me directly, right? Okay, thank you.